In thinking about Muhammad, one thing that is compelling to me to think about is how he's similar to and different from major figures in other religious traditions, particularly in Judaism and Islam, because Muslims are looking at what Jews and Christians are doing as early as during Muhammad's lifetime. He's making treaties with different groups of people, including Jews who are living in the area, as well as Christians. He's related to people who are Christians. So he, especially between that and his work as someone in trade, that he was well traveled and he was very familiar with practices of Judaism and Christianity in different places. But this didn't influence him to see himself or represent himself or to allow other Muslims to make him into a figure like Jesus. So Islam from the beginning considered Jesus really, really important, that Jesus is one of the prophets of power, one of the major prophets in Islam. These are all sort of figures who would be very familiar, already having thought about Judaism and Christianity: Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. These are the prophets of power. And then Muhammad comes along, and Muhammad is the last prophet. So Muhammad has the title of Rasul Allah, which means God's messenger, right? The Allah is just the word for God. And so Muhammad is God's messenger. And this means that he brings a revelation not only to a particular community, but also to a message that should be for all people. So he makes a kind of intervention in Arabian society, for example, but his ideas are also meant to be universal. And he's seen as the last prophet in Islam who comes along to correct corruptions in revelations that other groups have had. Those groups especially are Jews and Christians. And so in comparing the understanding of Muhammad in Islam and Jesus in Christianity, Jesus, as we know, is understood to be fully divine. While that's somewhat confusing for Christians to work out in a kind of systematic theology, it's very firmly a part of Christianity, and an essential piece to see Jesus as divine. But Muhammad absolutely is not divine. It's very firm. And it's really central, actually, to Islam's understanding of monotheism, that Muhammad is not divine, that this would sort of cross a pure monotheism in the minds of most Muslims to think that God could take a body, that God has to be infinite. And so the first big difference that we see is that Jesus is divine and Muhammad is mortal. But then, that kind of leads us to want to pause and think about how do Muslims think about Jesus, that Jesus is a really important prophet. He's understood to have had a revelation that was very informative, but one of the corruptions, even, that we might say that is part of Islamic tradition in terms of understanding Christianity, is the idea that Jesus is divine, that Muslims would really say that this is actually something that later Christians said about Jesus that distorted his truth and his revelation. So that's a kind of tension between Christianity and Islam, is to contend over the very nature of Jesus and his place in a kind of long history of prophets. I think the other really interesting prophet to whom Muhammad can be compared is Moses, right? So Moses also being really important in Islam. Moses is discussed more than any other prophet in the Quran, and he and Muhammad have very sort of interesting similarities in their lives, that they're orphaned when they're young. They kind of grow up. They don't really think that they're fit to be chosen by God to bring God's message. They seem sort of strange as a choice for God to make, but then ultimately they wind up leading these communities that really form around them. So I think that we can see that an idea of Moses that exists in Judaism fits more easily with the idea of Moses that exists in Islam, that there are no kind of issues to talk about the very conception of who Moses was, in the same way that there are with Jesus, even though Islam really maintains that Judaism also ultimately kind of corrupted or distorted the original message from Moses. And so, even as Muslims and Jews are looking at each other to understand Jewish law and Muslim law, I think that the other way that we can sort of see the perception of corruption within Judaism's kind of maintaining their message from God is in a kind of perception by Muslims that the Talmud leads to practices, kind of institutionalizes practices and concepts of God or God's revelation that are that go too far away from the original revelation. So we see that these three traditions are really closely tied. Islam has many of the same stories and the same central figures as in Judaism and Christianity, but unlike those two traditions, does not share a text with them, right? That the assertion of Islam is that Muhammad receives a perfect revelation over his lifetime from or via, let's say, the angel Gabriel, who's the mouthpiece for God, and this becomes a new text, one that represents a sort of uncorrupted message from God. And then within Islamic thinking, the Quran then remains in a perfect continuous chain of transmission. So the idea of a chain of transmission was really important in Judaism too, but Islam would contend that the chain was broken, or that in passing it down, it's not repeated perfectly. Whereas the Quran is understood to have been written down very carefully by people around Muhammad who could read and write. Muhammad himself is not understood to have been literate. It's part of his miracle of producing such poetry as is present in the Quran from Muslim thinking. And then once it's written down, it's understood to be passed on perfectly from generation to generation, that there won't be another prophet. It's a last chance, but there also doesn't need to be another prophet within Islamic thinking about the Quran, because it's understood to be really a perfect revelation that's perfectly recorded and then perfectly transmitted generation to generation.